As an American, much of my political attention over recent days has been taken up with events here in the United States, especially in DC. But as someone born British, much of my attention was taken up in the run-up to the new year by Brexit and whether the British would get a deal with the EU, a deal on which terms to exit. Technically, we left the EU, we being the British, left the EU at the beginning of 2020. There was then a year-long transition period, and the question was, on the 1st of January this year, would the British leave with no deal or with a deal signed with the European Union? We left with a deal signed with the European Union. And what matters for my purposes, and I think for Britain as a whole, about that deal is it's basically really Brexit. It is the thing that the people of Britain voted for when they voted in a referendum with a majority of 52 to 48 to leave the EU. Now, that was 4.5 years ago they voted that way. And in the time between the vote and the beginning of this year, when we were out of the EU completely with this new deal, we witnessed things the likes of which had not been witnessed, certainly in my lifetime in Britain. But they included some things that really have never happened in Britain. Never. Genuinely unprecedented. They include such remarkable things as a prime minister, I don't even know how to say it, collaborating with people in Parliament, members of Parliament, to not implement the vote of the democratic referendum. But more than that, to actually pass a law to prevent the Parliament from implementing for some time the outcome of that referendum. For some time, a law was on the books to prevent Britain from leaving the European Union on the pre-agreed deadline. To prevent Britain leaving because, according to the law, and if, according to the law, there was no deal. Now, obviously, the British referendum to leave the EU didn't say, do you want to leave the EU with or without a deal, with a deal or without a deal? It just said, do you want to leave the EU? And the British people said yes. The British people watched for years as a majority of parliamentarians who disagreed with the popular vote, the majority in the referendum to leave, did everything they could, including unprecedented parliamentary shenanigans, to frustrate the will of the people, to actually make illegal the implementation of a legal vote. It sounds ridiculous when you say it. It's like, well, it can't be true. Well, it was true. I'm not going to go into the details of how it was done. But the point for this video is we witnessed shocking things. We witnessed, I think for the first time in British history in 1,000 years, an attempt, which succeeded for a time, to actually essentially shrink the franchise, reverse democracy. Now, the British people, I'm generalizing, were very angry about that. Very, very angry. I personally was so angry that I put myself forward as a prospective parliamentary candidate. I was selected for the Brexit Party. Not because I was exercised about Brexit per se, although I'm pro-Brexit. No, I decided to disrupt my entire life. I'm an American who lives in the United States, and go back to the UK to stand for Parliament, because I simply couldn't imagine being on my deathbed and knowing that I stood by when British democracy was knowingly reversed. And if some of my American friends think that this might be a bit relevant to the United States, you're probably right. The takedown of democracy was dissimilar than the purported purported by some takedown of democracy, or attempt to take down democracy in the United States. But the fact that in both the UK and the US, in recent times and in present times, democracy itself is in play, right, is being threatened willfully, that means there's some overlap here. Okay, so we witnessed this horrific situation. For many years, the British people were told, time and time again, that there was no way they could get their Brexit on the terms they voted for, which was, get out. They were told that we couldn't possibly get a deal with the EU that was close to a clean break. And what was remarkable was that for many years, for those 4 years, people, regular people as well as people in power, actually believed, and certainly acted as if they believed, that the referendum result could be reversed or overturned. That we could actually simply rerun the referendum just because we didn't like the result. That was seriously being discussed for years. Like, news shows would seriously talk about the possibility of a second referendum. It was incredible, right? I mean, just imagine, again to my American friends, but everybody else, if all of the news, shows, all the news channels in America seriously talked 4 months after an election about just rerunning the election because they didn't like the result. No question of impropriety, right? I mean, in all elections there are some irregularities, of course, there are. But no question that the irregularities were what turned the election, etc., etc. But no, we just didn't like the result. So for all these hand-waving reasons, we could rerun it. That was taken seriously. That was taken seriously in the mother of parliaments, Great Britain, in a country where democracy has been increasing for 1,000 years, right? And certainly it's been the franchise has been deepening and widening for 200 years at a pace. How could this be? How could it be that supposedly moral, decent people who believe in democracy could seriously talk about not honouring the result of this referendum vote? And it should be said also that it was made clear at the time of the vote that it was an in-out referendum and that it would be honoured. So the parliamentarians actually handed over in law the decision to the people in this referendum. Okay, during this time, many millions of people who didn't like the result seriously talked about ignoring the result. This has a deep lesson, a deep, deep lesson for politics, for how politics works, for how culture works. And it is a very, very fundamental lesson about, I don't know what to call it, kind of almost political mechanics. It's huge, this lesson. It's kind of subtle. In a way, it's so subtle that when you say it, it's even hard to grasp. But see if you get my point. The lesson is this. Present reality is utterly normative. Now, okay, what do I mean? Well, obviously, if I were to describe present reality to you, if I was to give you, the way things are, I would be doing something descriptive. I'd be telling you how things are. But what people deem to be acceptable, what is morally conscionable, is mostly determined by what is happening right now, for good or ill, right? You've heard of the Overton window, which is the range of politically acceptable views. Well, the Overton window works more than just politically. It kind of works almost morally, right? The middle of the Overton window is whatever's going on today. Whatever people's lived experiences are, is kind of what we center our morality on, consciously or unconsciously. So for a time, because there was the seriously spoken possibility of reversing a referendum, a democratic vote in England, good people actually thought that wasn't an evil, anti-democratic thing to do, even though clearly it is an evil, anti-democratic thing to do. When the British people finally, years after the referendum, had the chance say to the politicians that their shenanigans were not acceptable in a general election. This was the last general election about a year ago in which Boris Johnson won on a platform of Get Brexit Done. When the people had a chance to vote for Get Brexit Done, to basically say, you weren't listening, we're going to tell you again, Boris Johnson won a landslide. And then, all of a sudden, the second referendum stopped being a practical possibility, right? Because he wasn't going to run that referendum again. No, he was going to implement the first referendum. All of a sudden, literally overnight, all of those people who said a second referendum would be good, would be justified, would be politically correct, if you'll excuse the expression, they all went quiet. Nobody said it was a good anymore to rerun that referendum. Nobody said that we should ignore the result. Once it became impossible to do so because of the change in our political reality in the UK. You see how when reality shifted, what was morally possible, allowed, acceptable, conscionable shifted, right? It's kind of weird because in politics we think about, what should be done and then we try and implement it. In that way, morality precedes intent and then intent precedes political outcome. But I'm saying no, the psychological reality, the societal reality, is what is made so determines not just what is practically possible, but what people even consider to be acceptable, to be something that they should morally push for in the name of democracy or justice or any other values. That's the first huge lesson of 4.5 horrific years of waiting for the implementation of the Brexit vote in the referendum. That reality, the present state of things, is not just the state of things, it is normative. It determines hugely what people deem should be the state of things. Okay, but there's another huge lesson. Whereas what I've just said hold, current reality determines what people in the short term, in the now, think should be done. In the long term, principles are unbelievably powerful. Principles are the thing that steer huge systems like a country, like a democracy, like a society over time. During this horrific 4 years of waiting for the implementation of the Brexit referendum, there were a group of people who, despite political reality of the time, kept saying, well, no, we're just not going to compromise on this. Because if we make a compromise on implementing the democratic will of the people, that's not just a practical compromise. That's not just a political compromise. That compromises what we are as a nation. That compromises everything we exist for, everything our democracy exists for. It compromises our spirit, our identity. It compromises the blood of the people who died, right? Fighting the Nazis, fighting for self-determination. It's a step too far. Now, a lot of those people formed a group that is now referred to as the Spartans. The Spartans because they would, they would not compromise. They were kind of, quote, ruthless, unquote, in standing firm. Because they did so, get this, because they did so, they bought time, they provided the guiding light. They reminded everybody, even as they were influenced by the reality of the time, what mattered most, what it was really about, what fundamentals were in play. So much so that as reality changed, right, as you went through these elections, as one prime minister was thrown out because of her incompetence in actually negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union, and we had a new leader, and then we had an election, and in the course of that, a brand new party, the Brexit party that was 6 weeks old, literally went from not existing to winning the European elections in Britain, etc., etc. All of this uncertainty happens, all of these changes. The thing that steers it all and ultimately determine that the British could leave the EU on the terms that were understood at the time of the referendum. The reason all that came to be was because the principles, the most fundamental principles, were kept by just a few. They were kept at times by a small minority of the parliament. What was right at the most basic level was advocated by only a few. But what is right, what is true, has huge power simply because it is right and true. It's kind of like a magnet that pulls things slowly but surely over time. As all of the craziness happens and people go off in all kinds of directions, a few people holding true to principle can win out in the end. So principle is powerful in the long term. Reality, the current state of affairs, for good or for ill, overwhelmingly powerful in the short run. But in the long run, right kind of makes might rather than the other way around. And what relates those 2 points that seem to pull in different directions? Well, a third huge fundamental lesson that Brexit reminds us of. And that is that when it comes to politics, we're dealing with more uncertainty than anybody knows. An infinite number of variables that can't be predicted, that can't be evaluated. And on each variable, there is so much uncertainty. Oh, and by the way, you don't even know which variables are in play. You can't even define them. You can't even put words on them, right? And I'm not talking like a complex system like, the solar system. I'm talking about something much more complex. When you're talking about a society, you're talking about beings with free will. Now, I don't want to make a metaphysical discussion on whether we have free will, but to all intents and purposes, people make choices. They experience themselves as making choices. We can't predict people's choices. We don't know what's possible. Now, a very, very interesting fact in this area, it also has a psychological basis, but has been tested in field after field and domain after domain, is that we tend to weight our predictions overwhelmingly toward present reality, right? Now, this kind of goes towards my first point, that present reality is normative as well as just what is so. We also are massively present time or present experience biased, right? So if you look at predictions over time, they all under-predict change. Because there's going to be a lot more change than anybody can predict, and because the change is going to be in ways that we can't imagine because of all these uncertainties and all these variables and all that is unseen and all the things that we don't know, etc., etc. So much more is possible than anybody expects in the moment. That, by the way, is why principle can play out as powerfully as it does, right? Because the future there's so much more up for grabs than people who predict think is up for grabs, right? There are so many more possibilities than people can see in the now. That's why principle is powerful. Prediction, in other words, when it comes to politics, is worthless. And that is why we should always be optimistic. And here is another lesson for my friends in America, and I am an American in America. Things look pretty dire in the US right now. Things look very dire for democracy in the UK. For years recently. I mean, we actually had a majority of representatives overtly saying they didn't want to honour a democratic vote. I mean, it's astonishing. Right? In some ways, it's not that bad here in America. I mean, in some ways, it's worse, right? But in some ways, it's not that bad. There aren't many people saying, oh, yeah, well, thanks for the vote, but actually, we don't think votes matter. Now, there's argument about whether the recent election was legitimate. Not much argument, actually, if you respect our democratic institutions and our constitutional institutions, which include our courts that have thrown out the claims, right? But In any case, you know, you get the point, right? Prediction is worthless, which means there's always more cause for hope, because there's always more that's possible than we can see. So stay true to principle and let time... If you stay true to principle, time is on your side. You know, in a video I recorded recently, I reminded you all of a quote by Colonel Prescott, who fought for the Patriots in the Revolutionary War. In a battle between patience and power, always back patience. Patience plus principle becomes power. It's real power. It was patience and principle that got the British their Brexit after all that attempt to frustrate it. It will be patience and principle that will fix America if we choose it. And just as right now in America, the way things are is giving permission to behaviors that are so problematic, as soon as the way things are changes fundamentally, you'll be amazed at how quickly those problematic behaviors, not only are they not acceptable anymore, no one's even seriously advocating them and therefore even worried about them. Things can change very fast, superficially, if people have held firm to what is right patiently for long enough. That's our hope, America. That's our hope.